Okay, so in this case, the international refers to some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Initially, I worked with colleagues from universities, University of Johannesburg in South Africa, University of Namibia, and the University of Zambia. You'll see that then expanded. The context is some design research approach to doctoral supervision, development and recognition. So this was an initiative that I led initially in the Institute of Education in UCL. And that was around collaborative workshops online because of the timing anyway. That is peri-pandemic. And with a view to collaborative development of colleagues' supervision, reflection, scholarly reflection, and their preparation for recognition via the UK Centre for Graduate Education Supervision framework. I invited two international colleagues, one Egyptian, one South African, to act as critical friends to that initial iteration within UCL. And then the South African said, hey, I rather enjoyed this. They both became fairly enthusiastic participants themselves, went on to gain UKCGE supervision recognition. And Lunetta said, can you work with me to introduce this in Southern Africa? So we did, and we co-led that iteration. Meanwhile, it was being developed further within UCL. And then as a follow-up to the Southern African iteration, which involved 20 academics from across South Africa, Namibia, and Zambia. Some of those participants wanted then to roll out a more inclusive Sub-Saharan Africa iteration. And you can see there the universities that were involved in last year's iteration. Being online, it's a comparatively economic sort of model. So UK CGE recognition as a doctoral supervisor brings with it an assessment fee. So that as costs. We haven't at any stage attempted to cost staff time. This is a collaborative initiative. We have attended conferences, and we have, in parallel, produced a bibliography I'll tell you about, because the African supervision literature is not well known or valued. It won't surprise you to know that in sub-Saharan Africa, higher education has undergone very rapid development recently. So there is quite an issue about availability of experienced doctoral supervision. Every iteration we've had, and it being design research, the iterations have changed each time, has evidenced two stages of benefit. One through the workshops, and we do require that participants commit to leading a half session themselves with a particular focus, doing the background academic work. So the focus, as I say, is on scholarly development, getting to know the literature, cultural supervision. And that commitment actually brings a host of benefits. But then from the first African iteration, it became clear that for a variety of reasons. Tagging on to that, some peer formative assessments as colleagues began to develop their applications for it. It was going to be a very valuable add-in. And in fact, we've done that in UCL since the first iteration. So these are sort of key publications. The last of those is a bibliography which was published a couple of weeks ago. And that's a live document. We can develop that as we go. But the idea is that it brings to the attention of researchers globally the extensive work that has been done in Africa around doctoral supervision. And as you might imagine, that does complement in important ways the literature which is available from global. So this is the sort of theoretical background that we're using in our research. So we understand doctoral supervision as both research and teaching. Within doctoral supervision development, reflection, really important. And so is for the African folks, developing academics and researching that development with an African lens. So using African ways of knowing, using the values that African colleagues bring to workshops, which are differ in important ways from those assumed in much of the and therefore evidencing ways in which African academics may develop differentially from the norm. So here's comparatively early analysis of some of our data, which is comparing the first, second, and third iterations, of which the second was in the first and third in UCL. So whatever we teach in our doctoral supervision in this country, it would appear that many of our esteemed colleagues at UCL do not typically engage in depth in reflective practice on their own. It's also true that they do not engage almost at all in the substantive literature around doctoral supervision. There is lots of that. And this is partly about priorities, and it's partly about what is valued in the academy. Doctoral supervision is not widely valued unless you're going to do it as a field. In terms of challenges which were particularly evidenced in the first African iteration, we had lots of cultural constraints. So in a collaborative development, we brought colleagues who live in a very hierarchical society, well, a variety of hierarchical societies where seniority really matters. Gender very often matters. And we tried to find ways of supporting them to be genuinely collaborative in the work. That was significantly more of a challenge than it was in UCL. And in part, that was because the nature of the intervention in Southern Africa attracted really quite senior colleagues. There were, of course, when you try and mix together somebody in UCL from a comparatively privileged background with African colleagues, there are challenges around post-colonialism. There are challenges in coming to know and understand one another's values and ways of knowing. I mean, tremendously enriching, at least for me and my African colleagues say similarly for them. And I don't think they're just being polite. But I have had to work really hard in trying to and to listen really hard and understand where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, I do not understand what it is, for example, to live in a South African society where you are confined first and foremost by the colour of your skin. There is no way I can understand. So the research that we're doing on the latest iteration is around the benefits and challenges for the African facilitators. So for this last round, Lunetta and I were support for some of our colleagues who'd gained supervisory recognition the previous round. And those are our research questions. We last year ran 2 parallel sets of workshops, both of which were led by a pair of Southern African women, one from the University of Johannesburg and one from the University of Namibia. And there's our collection and our approach to analysis, and in with the classical approaches to analysing academic developments. We, for these purposes, superimposed Shane Bijorano's framework that was around online learning as a community of interest, which requires a teaching presence, a social presence, a learner presence, each of which contributes to supporting that really important cognitive presence in online learning. And of course we had to bring a dominant theory of learning to this, which for us was socio-cultural. So at the minute, we haven't yet analysed the interviews with Lunetta and me. So briefly, a slide which is some of the challenges that I reported. So this is about the facilitators, the leaders, the African lead of last year's to theory. So there were challenges around the ways in which they could lead. Obviously, when it came to poor quality connectivity, variable attendance. So some of our participants were working in areas of a number of them were working in areas where there are frequent outages of electricity or significant challenges to other access to technology. We think we have difficulty here in London, but if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, that's exacerbated. But we did develop a number of compensatory ways around that. That seems to be quite important when we're working in a really resourced setting. When you're involving people from a variety of cultures and with these big issues of assumptions around gender and seniority, then establishing some of these things about teaching presence and learner presence within online communities can be really, really challenging compared with the ease with which we pivoted during the pandemic. I know it was challenging, but much more difficult in those sorts of contexts. And our facilitators reported a growing awareness of the need for frequent inter-workshops into workshop communications, reminding people where they were, what they committed to doing before the next workshop, and particularly those participants who are going to be leading the workshop. Working with colleagues requires a different sort of letting go. And it was really at quite a deep level of knowledge of in this case, doctoral supervision and teaching. And then there was the really interesting aspect of working across 10 different national cultures in one room and trying to understand what brought to the table and into the room, and what assumptions were being made and perhaps not always acknowledged. Leadership of this sort of thing is quite demanding, but very mental. It's not the same as leading workshops for students when it's your peers, sometimes your senior peers. And our facilitators sometimes found it quite difficult to balance the needs of participants who were leading the workshop with the needs of the rest of the participants. This being Africa, timeliness is understood rather differently from, say, in the UK, but differently within different African cultures. Interactions in the way of talking and listening are understood differently. And as I say, these ongoing, particularly obvious challenges of gender, seniority. And then this meta leadership is in the structure that we thought and facilitators found a steep learning curve. I personally have a range of challenges that I'm still working through, trying to capture and write about, coming from a point of view of epistemic empowerment, I think. But anyway, that's where we are at the minute, with as many, well, rather more challenges than we yet have solutions for, but beginning to find our way through some of those. Thank you. Thank you.